Downside Up, a world, stranger. Large crowds of many people, vast crowds that would gather together, sometimes many thousands gathered onto a giant stage, to sing and play instruments and to dance and perform together. Sometimes, often, many hundreds of people would perform together. Sometimes even thousands, tens of thousands would be performing together with only a very small group of people that were watching the giant performances. And then again, at giant sports venues, at the stadiums, many thousands of people gathered together to play against thousands of others. Sometimes there were two groups, and sometimes many more, with the teams playing against each other, vast crowds, and the small group that were spectating and reacting and cheering on the many thousands playing against each other. Along the streets, there were many well-dressed people, often in smart clothes, who would ask people if they needed any spare change, constantly offering money. Some people got tired of that, always being offered money all the time, and it was really hard to actually give away money onto people. You had to really push it onto them sometimes. You had to be very careful of the put pockets that were always around. Even though it happened quite rarely, it was quite common in some other areas, where you'd find money appear in empty wallets or pockets, or cupboards that would be stocked up with food when they were empty and bare when you'd left the house. So in many cases, you had to be very wary of the put pockets, where people would find money slipped into pockets once they come back from the streets. Because always the prices went down, of course, because of the inflation. Deflation was the norm, of course, and you could really absolve yourself of the burden of what to do with the wealth and invest it in something if you could find anyone that would accept it. Though, of course, there were only so many investments that a person could look after with limited time. Yet even if you buried all the money someplace, or invested giant amounts in various different enterprises, or even spent it all somehow if you found the time or energy, then again you'd find much more unexpectedly, finding rooms in houses you never even knew of, discovering houses that you owned that you knew nothing about. Or you'd find other belongings in the houses, in rooms that you hadn't gone in for an age, finding you owned far more than you ever imagined. As much as they longed for the simplicity, the austerity, it was not so easy for everyone to achieve that. Trying to give money to everyone when the majority just did not want to accept more. The children are often very serious-minded, of course. They are knowledgeable, and they seem to know a lot, yet they can be quite cynical at times too, as children in up-downland are prone to be. They're often found at work, and they work long hours too, doing emotional, physical work there. While the adults themselves are often quite casual and drifting, plenty of time to play and have fun. Even when they study occasionally, though, they're not able to work themselves. Clueless about how much and what's going on in life, they can be gullible at times and need to be cared for and guided by the children. Yet they do have an innocence about them still, and something that's fun and inspiring too. They're often found at plays, very emotional and sometimes physical plays they are too, and love their games like nothing else. Whereas, of course, the children are led by work primarily, and that's their incentive and goal in life, to earn and spend more. The adults will eventually grow down, of course, into children, given time. Of course, as all do grow down, it just takes a long time, and people grow down at different rates and different times. An angry child might shout at his adult, and grow down, for goodness sake. If they muck about too much, then they're prone to shout that. People are always being told to grow down. Lower and lower, deeper and deeper, the earth scrapers went. Buildings were built down deep into the earth. Well, of course they were. It always had been that way. You could only go down, couldn't you? It had been hard work spending so much. It was always hard work spending, easy to earn, really hard to spend though. So to find more money then fraudulently put into his account, to find he mysteriously had bank accounts with large amounts of savings he'd no idea of. It was really mysterious and bewildering for him. Mysterious amounts that were appearing in accounts he didn't even know he had. He'd not been able to give it away. And when he had spent all that time finally giving away everything to discover he had other accounts and so much in them, then he couldn't give those away. Because all the people he knew he'd already pushed as much as he could to. Spending it was hard and time consuming, took a lot of energy and focus. He went to a casino, hoping to lose it all on a wild night. Yet, just like the majority of gamblers, he returned with much more than he left with, frustrated and annoyed. But still, it was an enjoyable experience in some ways, and he learnt something from it. But leaving the casino with vast amounts of money, and even more money then to not know what to do with. Frustrating, but that's the way it went sometimes. Still, it was worth going because there was a chance he could have lost it all, even though he couldn't. He gave up after a long winning streak that depressingly just went on and wouldn't end, and got annoyed with that. Well, he tried to invest in something else expensive. It was all being given away or sold for very little, so he couldn't do it easily. And he already had so much that really everything was being given away so cheaply, he'd end up buying vast amounts more of things to take care of, not having the time for all that now. So it was easier just to keep on burying all the vast labyrinths at the landfills of things everywhere, stucking it out all around the house and the garden, and even on other friends' houses too, that had spare room for it. Landfills of money piled everywhere, and possessions stocked and stored in all different places. That was easier just to push it to one side rather than get rid of it all, because there was nowhere else to put it all, really. Then there were all the quadrillions that just couldn't be withdrawn from the accounts even. He didn't even know the name for it all, but there were quadrillions that he had. People said that was a small amount though, and not to worry for it, and he'd soon get rid of it all eventually. Death, security, and the pursuit of sorrows. That was still the dream, of course, of many people. Many people clung to that, even if others thought it was a little outdated, perhaps. Though many felt it hadn't really lived up to its full potential of what it could be. But nevertheless, all people were presumably still guilty of doing it sometimes, until proven innocent. Everyone was assumed guilty in life until you could prove your innocence. We were all guilty of everything, absolutely. But you had to prove your innocence, and that took a long time, naturally. And in love courts, people were accused of causing serious healing to other people, or giving something to someone, giving them money, or giving them some support, or even giving them some possessions, people giving cars and pushing houses onto other people. Pickpocketing, of course, was just one of the major, smaller offences there. Someone without them asking first. Really, if you hadn't asked permission, you had no right to give someone something kind or something that could be considered beneficial. No. Serial lovers were often given very long sentences at the love courts. Those that were proven, beyond reasonable doubt, to have rescued or cared greatly for others. One man accused of serving society for a number of years was then sentenced to live a minimalist lifestyle in seclusion for a couple of years, as a reward and recognition for his dutiful service. His lawyer was appealing against the decision though, and said it was wrong, all of it, hoping for a much longer sentence. How dare they give him such a short sentence? Others had been given 5 years in seclusion, with total austerity. I mean, why couldn't he be given that when they'd done about the same? He'd done as much work, or tried to, with his abilities, as them. So claimed the lawyer. Nevertheless, it came down to the proof. Others that had been proven to love many over decades, serving others in a whole variety of ways. Well, of course, they were given much longer sentences, but he deserved that too, a longer sentence, even though he couldn't really prove much of the work he'd done, for it was long, long ago. When they were able to prove it, though, they could be given life sentences of relative isolation or seclusion and minimalism, where they would have an austerity and very limited things to do and focus on. Although most passed on long before ever finishing their sentences. But the gift of solitude and minimalism were regularly given out to a great many people that were caught pickpocketing or doing other offences, of course. They were usually given large sums of money, the pickpocketers, given vast sums of money that could be then given as a lump sum, or if that was too much, they could just be given small instalments, but over a large period of time. At the zoo that he liked to go out and visit, there were lots of people there, lots of groups of people in various sized cages. They spent long periods of time, while the elephants, lions, monkeys, gorillas, and wolves, and many other animals that were roaming all about the cages, with the jungle that surrounded the thousands of cages spread around. Many of the animals liked to visit the humans, going up to their human cages, with their snouts going up close to have a good sniff up to the bars, to look closely to them. The many were unsure why they were there. It was a good way to safely protect, viewed the wilder animals, or some of them that were able to view that. Many of the caged people at the zoo were driven about in the wilderness, with their cages on wheels, of course, so that they could go around, and many of the other animals would get a chance to see them, study them, and learn something about them. It was an educational practice, really, in some ways, although people often enjoyed it sometimes as well. So they could move about in the zoo cages, and the animals could view them without disturbing them and the habitat too much. There was a woman next door he'd gone out to visit. She was watching one of the giant football games, as she loved to do. It was 2,000 people playing on each side against each other. There were 50 footballs in the game and 12 goals on either side, 6 on each side. She supported her team quite loyally and went to visit and watched them quite regularly, with the other 11 women that had to send the group, and it's a vast number of group that were sent out text messages or audio messages of encouragement or giving them advice on tactics and cheering them on often from the sideline. The small group would do. Her and the others were on loudspeakers, and the messages, the cheering, the shouts of encouragement, they were played over the tannoy for the thousands of players to hear, so that they were able to get some feedback and encouragement too. It was the third game this week that she'd been watching, and her husband was annoyed. It all seemed so long, and every game just seemed to be similar variations of the same old antics. Yet she found the crowds intricately variable, and all the movements and all the variations just so fascinating, and all the different tactics and all the different temperaments. And when it was her team, it was really an emotional roller coaster for her. She was quite invested emotionally within the games. She felt a great elation when the team had finally won, and even felt when they'd worked hard and still lost, quite proud of them still. And then that frustration when they'd lost and made stupid mistakes sometimes, or had given up too early. Yeah, she felt quite emotionally driven about it all, really. Often when the two goalkeepers, both in the same goal, of course. Every goalkeeper had dozens of goalkeepers, of course. But when two of the goalkeepers collided with each other, as often happened, and not with the ball, then she would get angry at the panel of referees and send text messages appealing to them. There were hundreds of referees, though, of course, in a giant game, with 200 eager eyes watching the game of thousands of players play out. "Missing an obvious foul," texted one of the watchers. And if they claim some accidental collision was perhaps a foul, it will be sent to the many hundreds of referees to debate and discuss it between them. There were specialist groups of referees that could discuss the specialist different concerns that were sent and rerouted to them. The husband was glad that the game was finally over, even though it gave him time to do some cleaning up round the house, have a chat and a catch up with some friends that had come round to the room. When the wife and her other girls, the ladies, were all watching the game, encouraging it on together. Well, they were the many monitors to watch. 170, 162, shouted the score. The result was called through by the wife after a tense end of the game, full of gasps and screams and cries and shouts. With over 160 people that had been red carded and sent off during the game, half of them would be banned for the next game. 400 had received yellow cards, apparently for some minor foul or offence. They had been very high amounts, and many of those would be appealed against to the referees with the video footage that could be reviewed after. And the ladies with the wife were complaining that the League of Referees had been overzealous, giving out too many yellows and reds. That particular panel was always like that. It was only 12-hour game, of course, thankfully, a short version, not like one of the 48-hour versions. So they had no excuse to be so tired and making sloppy decisions, surely. In any case, it was not good for the family, thought the husband, if the wife was regularly monitoring the games, even if it was to give game support to the large numbers. Though his arguments were undermined by the fact that their daughters had a love of the monitoring and supporting of the giant team games too, and they spent a long time discussing the various tactics and all the different temperaments of the actual game and the strategies and objectives, discussing it with each other, endlessly so. The 15 managers had sent to her and to the others many concerns about it that they were then discussing, and how to convey it all to the vast group then playing against each other in their numbers. They then had to interpret what the managers had sent to them and then give those as messages of encouragement and cheering to the many thousands playing against each other. They were never just 12-hour games, of course. There were the longer versions of those games when she'd been given the group advice and then the encouragement and reminding them of the different managers' various tactics, since they were so busy talking to their other subgroups and the other managers themselves about changing strategies as the long games went on. Despite a little serious talk, though, post-match discussions on the appealing of a number of red and yellow cards and other things, but the many ladies and a few girls joining them, the older girls, had great laughs at some of the weirder sights that they saw during the funny old games that they could see on the highlights afterwards, that could sometimes last an hour or two. There were those that attempted to run, fully clothed, could you believe it, onto the game occasionally, only on special occasions, of course. And they were usually chased away if they didn't submit to be stripped and to be exposed and naked, like everyone else was, of course. They were escorted away. They were from the clothed colonies, often, but not always. Some of them had other reasons. They didn't all have a clothing agenda. Some people just came from the clothing colonies, and they lived like that back at home. They were just like that. They lived fully clothed in textile worlds, as it was called, the textilers. Though far from other people, those that attempted to dress up in public, they could be charged with indecently covering up, hiding things away, hiding their own body, as if it was something to be ashamed of. It was something unnatural or shameful somehow. People suspected the textilers, the clothers, were perhaps doing it for some weird sexual fantasy. Who knew what their motives were? Perhaps they had mixed motives and different reasons for doing it. It was a mental disorder, though, and the majority were firm in agreeing on that. But no, if they did it in their own textiled world, away from others, and didn't push it on people, perhaps it wasn't so bad. Many relented and were lenient and more understanding. And there were many more liberal and open-minded. Maybe the textilers had a reason for it. Who knew? And maybe it wasn't just driven by purely sexual reasons after all. Many claimed that they had other reasons for wearing the clothes. The textilers said they felt more comfortable that way. Nevertheless, despite many more clothing communities, a suspicion about them always remained in the wider mainstream society. What was so special about them that they had to cover up when no one else needed to? No one cared if you were over or underweight. It was common and widespread. Lots of people were. Who cares? Or had scars or spots or stretch marks or scratches or skin marks or rashes or swellings or bulges. Who cared? We all had different things like that. Everyone did. What difference did your things make that made your things any more important than the others that were quite capable of showing them? No, it didn't make any sense. And what size or colour you happen to be, everyone has seen 10,000 arses before, and yours made no difference anyway. What made you so special to cover up? And that was the mentality of a great many, of course, who were just so used to seeing things quite openly. And they weren't shocked in the slightest. Why should they be, to see different sizes and shapes of different bodies? Yet a clothed person walking down a naked street could produce such shock, revulsion in a few, disgust in many, and concern, mystery. Why would they do that? What's the purpose of it? Many had thought, whilst others had felt sorry for them. Or maybe they were just mentally ill to do that around others, and not knowing why they're doing that, and living in unnecessary shame. Others just laughed at them, though, a little meanly, those covering up, and thought they could just look ridiculous. They did look ridiculous, wearing clothes all the time, though, to be fair. That's what some people thought. Whilst there were a growing number, yet even if they were small, they were a sizable minority that supported the rights of the clothers for people to wear clothes wherever they wanted to. They were seen as still liberals, and some of the extremist liberals that thought you could wear clothes even in other people's houses, in private people's houses that you'd visit. Well, many people supported the rights of the textilers and thought that if they weren't actually hurting others, then perhaps they weren't so bad. Some liberals even experimented and went on clothing holidays to remote places they visited, far away from mainstream society, where they wear clothes all day and where they cover up whole parts of their body, even the legs and the arms, unbelievably, as some people thought. Mainstream society, of course, did reflect the diversity of different views. There were even liberal shows that encouraged people to try wearing more clothes. It was at a late hour sometimes. It couldn't be shown during the day, though. Some people had different views about those shows. There were the usual complaints by some, although others wondered why they were watching clothing shows, if they were so offended by that. Yet clearly there were many others, however, small in their number, wanting the right to be clothed. And there were even people going on clothing protests. Those didn't happen in some areas, though. Of course, there were exceptions to the nudist society. That was the norm. Those that had covered up for the elements and that had a genuinely good reason to do that. But those were the rare exceptions, of course. Those once out of the sweltering sun or the icy cold winds, then of course they would always take their equipment off, liberating themselves from the heavy steel-cap boots worn to protect their feet, or the temporary trousers that they could be wearing if passing through a field of nettles that could sting them perhaps, for example, or something equally precarious. People were only wearing clothes merely to protect themselves against the worst extremities of the elements, the cold, icy winds, sweltering heats sometimes, where they would wear ice and cooling venting clothing. Everyone was assumed to be absolutely mental in society, to different extents, and in a variety of different ways. There might be a small group of people out there that had a serious amount of sanity, but even people had doubts about how widespread that was really. In a variety of different ways, though, everyone was completely mad. And so whether having mild, moderate, or even severe issues, even though it fluctuated all the time, and no one was severely mental all the time, but everyone was mental, or had access to take it through with a legion of psychiatrists. They were everywhere. It was easy to get access to them anywhere, of course. There were far more qualified, experienced counsellors than there were people anymore. So there was often an abundance of counsellors. It was often too easy to get access and see one. People complained that there were just too many counsellors, and they were assigned multiple different counsellors. And that happened all the time. It was common for serious and escalating problems. People got annoyed at the waiting lists to see the counsellors because they were just too quick. Sometimes even after just a few days, even sometimes just after hours, after a problem was confessed to or was found out, then counsellors would be messaging in, a dozen so, and then you'd find that there was hardly time to even prepare for the conveyor belt of the various appointments that had already been arranged and set up, and they'd already be visiting later in the day. Like with counsellors, the students found it a struggle keeping up with all their many teachers. It was on average for many students to have up to 40 teachers per class, and they would sometimes have several classes a day. So they could have 100 or 200 teachers that they would see in an average day sometimes. Those would see them throughout the week as well. Even though they wouldn't know all of the 200 or more teachers intimately, they gradually get to know them throughout the academic years. Unless they changed schools sometimes, that they did. But often, half or even a dozen classes that they could have per week, so that during the academic year, a student could have hundreds of teachers. Not that you could remember all their names, but you did get to know something about them and what they were into and things. You could remember some of the lessonings after the teachers would work together to support the students, yet also could be struggling with each other, interrupting each other so disruptively with each other's teachings. So it was down to the student himself to stop all the teachers from disrupting each other during the class, from arguing or mucking around and having fun, or just generally disrupting others' lessons, as many of the teachers would do if the student wasn't careful to monitor and moderate them carefully in each of his different classes. He had to try and work out a system to include all of the teachers and allow them each to have their time and space. The students had to constantly watch out for some of the teachers bullying the other teachers, and then stand up to the racist, sexist, or homophobic, classist, or generally prejudiced teachers that might outspeak hate speech or something to other teachers. That could affect the other teachers there. You could always report any concerns, of course, to other students. When during the school breaks, then they would have to discuss the problem teachers that they'd noticed. Quiet teachers that were too withdrawn and just needed some encouragement to bring them out of their shell more. Perhaps outspoken teachers that needed to be more cautious, considerate of the sensitivities of others, and just needed to be reined in a little. Maybe, and then there was a small group of other students met up to chat about their concerns about the teachers. They would meet up during the work break in the work ground, a place where they would mulch around together to have their serious discussions, especially if there was a very abusive or very delirious and confused teacher out there, or even if there was a teacher that was completely withdrawn and seemed too passive. Then, of course, the students could inform, if they weren't able to resolve it between themselves, the head student himself. Every school had his head student, who might then summon the teacher to the office or call up the teacher's parents, even if they had concerns about the teacher's home life. Of course, the numbers were against them, though. How could a few dozen students really supervise many hundreds of teachers that they had in their different classes, who roamed the playgrounds and continued during break times? Quite often the teachers did play together during those times, and some of them, the majority, would eat happily together in the canteen. Yet there were the teachers that would sometimes fight other teachers, and you had to watch over that, or belittle them sometimes when a few got excluded and could play truant and disappeared out of the school altogether. The missing teachers that didn't return to class, that the students had to watch out for when they called out their registries. And then there were a few teachers that had to be expelled by the head student and other students too, after their long discussions, excluded from the school. Many received multiple warnings though, and often were kept in detention by the students themselves, especially when teachers sometimes vandalised the school equipment, or they were playing truant too many times, or interrupting the lessons of other teachers too often, or they were just absent from lessons altogether. Then their families would of course have to be sent letters by the head student, or it could be the head of year student if it wasn't the head of school student. They would send out their letters and do their investigations, perhaps, if appropriate, with the teachers' families, to find out what was wrong. The teacher's partner and the children could be summoned in for discussion about the problems at home or outside by the head student if they still had those serious concerns, or perhaps a change of method, a different school that could be better and cater for their different needs more. Even in rarer cases, a change of profession could even be suggested by the head of year or head of school student. They had special schools for those troubled teachers, and there were many expelled teachers that went to those, large numbers in the end. Many more, and many students debated whether that was a good idea, and whether they should in fact make more effort to include them. There were many debates about that with students and the student councils. In other schools, there with less teachers for them, so they had less teachers for them to work with, and many more students who could then monitor the progress more closely. More disabled teachers that went to special schools for the disabled. They were taught in mainstream schools sometimes though, others taught in specialist disabled schools. Though there was some debate on whether there should be more integration or whether it was right to have different schools for different abilities. But still, many students went to blind schools where only blind teachers could there be taught, or they went to emotionally challenging schools where regularly teachers there would get overly emotional themselves, teaching very emotionally, and they would sometimes break down in tears in front of the class, or get angry, or get upset and depressed over it all, or be singing and dancing for joy and elated and celebrating. There were very emotional lessons, or hilarious and bursting out in laughter, having a funny lesson perhaps, where the teachers could be mucking around a lot of the time, where they had play school for the playful teachers. And the students had to keep reminding the teachers there to get back to this serious point, and that there was a serious point to the funny stories, and it wasn't always just a game that they were there for. Everyone learnt At the school, her story, of course. Still many men were upset. It had been so often by women, written by women for women. Well, that was her story, of course. Admittedly, the gender gap had been lessened over the years. There were many more men that were writing her stories as well now. Lots of men had broken into the field, finally being accepted with the other historians, who attempted to show the changing role of men throughout history, that it wasn't just the historians that had to adapt and change for a modern age. There were many more doctors, judges, preachers, teachers, even in the police force and soldiers. There were many more that were accepting men now, and that they weren't totally effeminate as they always had been, and nearly totally women dominated. That men now had increasingly been entering into those professions and had really transformed them in some ways. There were even men in the army serving as soldiers, but that upset many people, although others saw that it was really acceptable and a necessary change after the effeminate armies of so many centuries before. Still, it had divided public opinion over the years, even if there was increased acceptance. It was seen as a step too far, though, for many, the traditionalists, that wanted to keep those professions matriarchal as they'd always been. Many longed for the days of the purely matriarchal armies, when only women could actually fight, and they felt that gender equality was a misplaced goal, and that men had no place in armies and soldiers and police forces, or to judge other people, or even to be doctors. And both had a lot of different gifts and disadvantages, but they were suited to such different roles, many thought, and that they could complement each other without having to be integrated into similar work. But there were a whole variety of different views. If they could adapt well still, nearly all soldiers, all were women, but the men that had now been enlisted and had chosen to join up over the last century much more, were a growing minority still. And of course, women still dominated the army and the police force and the courts and politics in general, as in many, many other professions too. Even if there was a growing minority of men that had only slowly transformed how those various organisations had worked. Being a soldier was historically a highly emotional, as well as mental and physical struggle, but much more emotional than physical, even though there was a little of both. Though it wasn't that to a lesser extent. It was the matriarchal intensive school that taught soldiers how to emotionalize, how to read and understand others' emotional needs, their desires, their fears, and the such necessary emotional drives that each and all of us had to read the true emotional situation of any situation or person. For any kind of emotional, ideological conflict that was absolutely necessary. So the new wave of men joining had also forced them to integrate and to change their beliefs from being, and they were having to be more detached and objective. When concerns over others had to be restrained and reconciled with their objectives and the necessities of survival, physical needs, desires, and fears were then becoming more increasingly important in consideration by the strategists who no longer saw the soldiers or civilians even as purely emotional, subjective, sentient beings. They thought everything and everyone was just a sentient, animals and people included. But they were also much more seen then as objects, physical beings as well. Many men had complained that they were still being expected, though, to fit in with a woman's world, and some mocked and ridiculed her story and saying it was just all written by women for women. Whilst there were even others that felt like history itself was just a silly attempt to try and undermine the long-standing, respected tradition of her story and the expectation that any man should have to have a career as well as being a father at home and looking after young children. Some people thought that that was too much to expect anyone to deal with, worrying that he could not juggle such many demanding work without compromising one of the roles as a provider at home and protecting for the family too, especially for the children, where the traditionalists wanted to see men back in the home, cooking, cleaning and washing the children much more, being their at-home protector, rather than going out and being career men, as they were often being much more. More, they wanted a return to the discipline home. Yet a greater many were glad that men weren't just chained to the kitchen sink as they used to be, and the many other domestic chores that filled their whole lives in the past. And that the women who'd always worked for society and had responsibility to their own children too, not just to run and provide for all society, they should be concerned about their own children, and not just the wider world, as they'd been much more prone to in the past. There were many more male preachers, had much more rational, logical sermons, when for an age only women ever preached, except of course for clandestine men in private or daringly, sometimes men that had pretended to be women, sometimes many often men had dressed up as women, spoke as women, or acted as women, just to pretend, so that they could pass themselves off, being able to preach, judge, act, teach, or doctor others, or any other numerous, well-known effeminate roles, or even to pass oneself off as a teacher even. So there were countless examples in her story where a man had to be in drag and had to act and sing and dance and talk as a woman, who'd passed themselves off as a woman in society in order to go undercover, enabling them to teach in some of the schools in the earlier days, working in the effeminate schools as a man undercover. No, not so long ago, when every actor at theatre was a woman, of course. They acted all the male parts, because it was against the law, even back then, to actually perform as a man on stage. Only a woman could really do that. Not without attracting unwanted attention, as the men would do themselves. So they would easily put on their fake beards, or they would deepen their voices in their way. And sometimes they would tie in their breasts, strap down, or wear them easily over baggy clothing that would hide it. That was very easy for some of them to do. But even though it was quite obvious they were women, but they went to some extent to do it sometimes. Women acted as passionate macho lovers sometimes, or even devoted or absent fathers, struggling to know what to do about children. But they were epic, sensationalist dramas, heavily emotional, that played out in the theatre schools and even in the temples, all over the place where the dramas were, when it was seen as good and objective, to stir up the audience's emotions and make them emotionally feel again, and to provoke them to emotions. Not necessarily to think so well, but that was sometimes important, but to make them feel truly and authentically. That was the goal. If they left somehow sorrowful, angry, joyful, ecstatic, or even bewildered, mixed up emotionally, or any other amount or combination of those things, or all of those things, if they left somehow emotionally after the event or the show or the act, or even after the lecture or the sermon or the performance, then at least you could say they weren't so detached and objective, and that they were feeling more, and that they were actually being more sentient again. And that was viewed as the epic failure if they left only more logical and objective, but numb to emotions, with no feelings. If an audience didn't leave in fury, in tears, or in confusion, or in laughter even, or in song and dance and merriment, even in fury, that was preferable to leaving numb and cold and detached and objective and clear and rational in thinking about things. Yes, there'd been the critics who felt the performance they had lacked some order and logic and rationale behind them. The purely subjective, emotional plays and the meetings had their good and bad outcomes, many had thought, yet even the good experiences, when it seemed both an authentic and emotionally conscious, a sensitive piece, still wasn't always relevant to that particular audience that they were attending, despite, or some argued, because of the irrationality inherent in many of the emotionally charged plays and stories. But the matriarchal institutions were very popular, nevertheless, widespread and ubiquitous. Everyone loved it. Well, maybe not everyone, but many did, a majority, where they thrived for an age. And many still survived in women only performances. Many more were just women dominated institutions still. For a long time, it was only gradually in some of the institutions and only in some of the places that the first male doctors, actors, judges, preachers, and even